Hey, this is Joe from Home Studio Corner. Today we're going to answer the question, should you use a limiter in mixing? Before we do, if you want to learn the whole mastering process, which is where limiters really come in handy, and you don't have a current system that you use, it can be intimidating. Check out my mastering course. It gives you a simple to follow process for every mastering session you'll ever do for the rest of your life. Go to homestudiocorner.com/master to check it out. Before we go too far, let's make sure we're on the same page as to what a limiter does. I've got a limiter here on my mix bus. This is the last thing touching the mix. And I'm using the FabFilter Pro L2. This is one of the only paid plugins that I own. It is a fantastic limiter. One of the many things I like about it is I can adjust the window to see kind of a history of what's happening on the mix. So right now, with this on here and no gain added, it's not doing anything. And we can see that in the readout if we hit play on this mix. Okay, now I'm going to turn the volume down on my mixer. As I push up this gain to usually around +6, you're going to see the level of the audio, the blue part, go up. And then when it hits this ceiling up here, this subtle red line at the top, you're going to see that's when the limiting happens. So what a limiter is, it's like a compressor on steroids that stands at the pass like Gandalf and says, no, you shall not pass. And the idea is anything that crosses this, what we call the ceiling, which I've got set to -1, which is just 1 decibel below clipping, it stops. And now a few little folks tend to sneak through, but generally speaking, you can just go whoop and shove your mix into a limiter, and it will increase the overall volume without letting anything clip. So what does that mean? It means the loudest things in your mix, for example, like the snare drum here, are going to be one of the first things to get affected by the limiter. The quieter stuff won't get limited, it'll just get turned up in volume, and the loudest stuff is going to get clipped or limited, and it's probably going to change how it sounds. Let's take a look. Okay, so there, the limiter's almost doing nothing. You can see here, it did a little bit of gain reduction on 1 snare hit. So we haven't even gotten to where it's doing much. Let's just keep pushing the volume and see what happens. Scene of a dying flower, the petals falling, now her sweet faces, so hard to find. What I love about this plugin is I can get a visual representation of what my ears are hearing. So you can see whenever it crosses the threshold, it starts to turn things down, and if it crosses it a whole lot, it gets turned down a whole lot. So this kind of reverse waveform in red is showing exactly how much the limiter is working. The gain reduction, which you see over here, this is showing how much is being turned down at any given moment. That shows the history of that gain reduction here. Now, should we make all our decisions based on what that red thing is doing? Not necessarily, but it's a good learning tool to kind of see what happens when I push volume up into a limiter. It got louder, but it also changed a lot of the way the louder things sound, like kick and snare drum and the vocals and the cymbals. They all sounded different, not just louder, but they were affected by this limiter. Let's talk about that. First, let's talk about why people would argue against using a limiter in mixing. It comes from a place of let's keep things separate. Let's mix here and let's master here, right? Historically, there were mixing engineers, and then that mix got sent to a mastering engineer. And since limiting is a big part of what the mastering engineer's job is, the limiter should be saved for that part of the process. I completely understand that. I've actually taught that years ago of being a smart way to work. The thought being, this allows me, if I don't put a limiter over here, I'm just hearing the mix in its purest form with all its dynamics, and I can make all the proper mix decisions here, and then later the mastering engineer can make all the limiting decisions. And even if it's me in both scenarios, that hard line in between makes a lot of sense. Except I don't think it does. The reality is our mixes are going to go through a limiter at some point before they're finished, right? The final destination is mastering and then release. with that in mind, I like to have a limiter available during the mixing process. I don't mix through the limiter. I do my mixing without the limiter there, but anytime I go to export it, to go listen in my car, to send it to the band for review, any number of reasons, I put a limiter on there. And the reason is kind of twofold, though actually threefold. The first is it gives me the volume that I want. A mix volume is pretty low. So if I don't put it through a limiter, it's going to sound too quiet. I might not be able to hear it very well in the car. And the client, if I'm doing this for somebody else, might think I don't know what I'm doing because they listen to all this stuff that sounds nice and loud, and then I'm sending them mixes that sound all wimpy and sterile. Turns out if they could just turn it up and hear it, they'd know it sounds amazing, but because I didn't put a limiter on there, it's like they're starting to listen thinking, oh, this guy doesn't know what he's doing. I'm starting with like one strike against me. So practically speaking, putting a limiter there, getting that overall volume up, helps it feel more like a finished product, which helps us listen differently than we would if it was really quiet. The second thing I like about using a limiter is it gives me a little bit of an idea of how my mix will respond to limiting. If you've never done a whole lot of mixing and then mastering, you know that the way you handle transients in mixing, for example, if you leave the snare super pointy in your mix, it sounds different after you've mastered it. And a lot of times it's a cool thing. If you bury the snare in your mix, the snare doesn't get really hit by the limiter, so it doesn't get that extra little bit of kind of coolness that happens when you run it through a limiter. I learned that over the years. I started pushing my snares a little bit louder so that the limiter in the mastering process would clip those snares a little bit and cause kind of that cool modern sound that we're used to when it comes to snare drums. So running my mix through a limiter when I go to do my listens in the car, on earbuds, things like that, gives me a better idea of how my mix will respond to mastering, whether I'm going to do it or not. And that will affect my mixing decisions and help me hopefully make better decisions that will make the mastering process even easier and better for whomever is going to do the mastering. And the third piece is I learn and get better at mastering by putting a limiter on my mixes. Because kind of the same reason as before, I'm learning how the limiter behaves, so I'm giving myself more repetitions because the mastering process is decidedly shorter than the mixing process, right? Mixing just takes longer. So I don't get as much time. I don't get to put in as many reps during mastering as I do with mixing. But if I put a limiter on my mix bus for all my exports, now I'm getting to hear what's happening with the limiter in addition to all the mixing stuff that I'm doing, and I'm training myself to listen for how the limiter is interacting because that's going to help me become a better mastering engineer as well. It's worth noting I don't include the limiter on the final export of the mix when it's going to mastering, right? It's only there for me to listen to as I export, but I remove the limiter when I'm sending it over to mastering. Now, if you want to learn the mastering process and you don't have a way of doing it that gives you any sort of confidence towards your ability to master, really encourage you to check out my mastering course. It will not only teach you, I'm listening to a book right now that talks about how there's kind of two types of learning. There are people who want to memorize the answers and they learn the process of how to guess the answers or how to hone down on the exact answers. And then there are people who really want to understand the concept. Who would you rather performing brain surgery on you? The surgeon who memorized the procedures based on the book, or the surgeon who has a deep understanding of how all of this works and why each piece of that memorized process is there, right? You're going to want the person with the actual understanding because then they can pivot when problems come up, right? Same thing in mastering. I could show you a mastering chain that I use, for example, and tell you what settings I use and recommend that you use those, but that's not going to be very helpful. It might help once in a while. That might be the right setting for the master that you're working on, but otherwise it's fairly useless. However, if I teach you the concept of why I make each of those decisions, how I make those decisions, and what I'm listening for, now you can go and apply that to any style of music and any mastering job that comes your way. So that's what I'm offering to you as a part of the mastering course. Go check it out at homestudiocorner.com/master.